Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 125, The Sovereign of Heavenly Wisdom. The people of Baekje looked around at the strange and unfamiliar land. They had fled a war-torn country, and they were happy to be alive, but refugee status was hardly a walk in the park. Fortunately, they still knew how to farm the land, even if their homeland was hundreds of miles away across the sea and, well, occupied by hostile forces. Here at least was a land where they could make a home for themselves. Some of them had to wonder whether this was really permanent. Was their situation just temporary until their kingdom was restored? Or were they truly the last people of Baekje? And what would that mean? Either way, it would mean nothing if they didn't work the land and provide for their families. And so, as with displaced people everywhere, they made the best of the situation. They had been given land to work, and that was more than they could have hoped for. They might never return to Baekje, but perhaps they could keep a little of it alive for themselves and their descendants. Greetings, everyone, and welcome back. Last episode, we talked about the downfall of Baekje and the defeat of the Yamato forces at the Battle of Hakusuki-no-e, also known as the Battle of Baekgang, in 663. And yet, something else happened as well. The sovereign, Takara Hime, aka Saimei Tenno, died just as the Yamato forces were setting out. Immediately, Prince Naka no Oe took the reins of government. He would be known to later generations as Tenshi Tenno, with Tenshi meaning something like heavenly wisdom. Now, Prince Naka no Oe has been in the forefront of many of our episodes so far, so I'd like to start this episode out with a recap of what we've heard about him, as all of this is important to remind ourselves of the complex political situation. I'm going to be dropping and recapping a lot of names, but I'll have many of the key individuals listed on the podcast website for folks who want to follow along. I would note that this episode is going to be a summary with some extrapolation by me regarding what was actually happening. Just remember that history, as we've seen time and again, is often much more messy and chaotic than we like, and people are more complex than just being purely good or evil. People rarely make their way to the top of any social hierarchy purely through their good deeds. Now, to start with, let's go back to before the year 645, when Naka no Oe instigated a coup against Sogono Iruka and Sogono Emishi. In the Ishii incident covered in episode 106, Naka no Oe had Sogono Iruka murdered in court right in front of his mother, Takara Hime, as she sat on the throne during her first reign. And yet, though he could have taken the throne when she abdicated in apparent shock, he didn't. Instead, he took the role of crown prince, but this wasn't just him sitting back. In fact, evidence suggests that he used that position to keep a strong hand on the tiller of the ship of state. Now, prior to the Ishii incident of 645, the rule of Yamato sovereign had been eroded by noble court families. These families, originally set up to serve the court and its administration, had come to dominate the political structures of that same court. The main branch of the Soga family, in particular, had found its way to power through a series of astute political marriages and the support of a new foreign religion, Buddhism. Soga no Iname, Emishi's grandfather, had married his daughters to the sovereigns and thus created closer ties between the Soga and the royal lines. He also helped ensure that the offspring of those marriages would be the ones to take over as future sovereigns. Soga no Iname took for himself the position of O-Omi, the Great Omi or the Great Minister, the head of the other ministerial families, and he passed that down to Soga no Umeko. As prime minister, they both held great sway over the day-to-day running of the court and the execution of much of the administration. Much of this was covered in previous episodes, but especially episodes 88, 90, 91, 92, 95, 98, 99, and 103. As I said, we've covered this quite a bit. Now, Soga no Umeko was joined in his efforts to administer the government by his grandnephew, Prince Umeyato, also known as Shotoku Taishi, son of Tachibana no Toyoi, aka Yomei Tenno, and thus grandson of Umeko's sister, Kitashi Hime, and the sovereign that we know as Kinmei Tenno. Now, Umayato's aunt, sister to Tachibana no Toyoi, was Kashikiya Hime, or Suiko Tenno. The three of them, Sogono Umiko, Prince Umayato, and Kashikiya Hime, together oversaw the development of Yamato and the spread of Buddhism. Buddhism was also controversial at first, but they turned it into another source of ritual power for the state. Ritual power that Sogono Umiko, Prince Umayato, and even Kashikiya Hime were able to harvest for their own use. Unfortunately, the crown prince Umayato died before Kashikiya Hime, suddenly leaving open the question of who would take the throne. Sogono Umiko himself passed away 2 years before Kashikiya Hime, and when she in turn passed away, there was another struggle for the throne, this time between the descendants of Crown Prince Umayato and Sogono Umiko. Eventually, Sogono Umiko's son and heir, Sogono Emishi, made sure that a more pliant sovereign, Prince Tamura, would take the throne, and Prince Umayato's own son, Prince Yamashiro no Oe, was cut out of the succession. Sogono Emishi, serving as prime minister, effectively ran things much as his father had. When Tamura died, his queen, Takara Hime, took the throne rather than passing it back to Umayato's line, no doubt with Emishi's blessing. Sogono Emishi was careful, however, not to provoke direct action against Yamashiro no Oe, possibly due to the reverence in which Yamashiro's father, Prince Umayato, aka the Buddhist saint Sho Tokutaishi, was held. Meanwhile, Emishi appears to have been cultivating his grandson by way of Tamura, that is, Prince Furubito no Oe, to eventually succeed to the throne, trying to duplicate what his own grandfather, Iname, and then his father, Umiko, had been able to accomplish. Sogono Emishi's son, Sogono Iruka, was maybe not quite so temperate. Who would have thought that growing up at the top of the social hierarchy might make one feel a bit, arrogant and entitled? When Sogono Emishi was ill, Sogono Iruka took over as prime minister, and he didn't just stand back. He decided that he needed to take out Furubito no Oe's competition, and so he went after Yamashiro no Oe and had him killed. Unfortunately for him, he went too far. There were already those who were not happy with the Soga family's close hold on power, or perhaps more appropriately, this particular line of the Soga family. This kind of behavior allowed a group of discontented royals and nobility to gain support. According to the popular story recounted in the Nihon Shoki, the primary seed of resistance started with a game of kickball, or kemari. Nakatomi no Kamako, aka Nakatomi no Kamatari, was a scion of his house which was dedicated to the worship of the traditional kami of Yamato. The Nakatomi were ritualists in charge of chanting ritual prayers, or norito, during court ceremony. This meant that their power base was directly challenged by the increasing role of Buddhism, one of the Soga patriarch's key influences on the political system. Kamatari was feeling out the politics of the court and seemed to be seeking the support of royal family members who could help challenge the powerful Soga ministers. He found that support in two places. First, in Prince Karu, brother to Takara Hime, the current sovereign, who had been on the throne ever since her husband, Tamura, had passed away. And then there was Prince Katsuraki, better known to us today as Prince Naka no Oe, a game of kemari where a group of players tried to keep a ball in the air as long as they could, using only their feet. Well, that was just the chance he needed to get close to the prince. When Naka no Oe's shoe fell off in the middle of the match, Kamatari ran over to retrieve it. As he offered the shoe back to its owner, they got to talking, and from there, one of the most impactful bromances in Yamato history was born. The two ended up studying together. The unification of the Yellow River and Yangtze Basin regions under the Sui and Tang and the expansion of the Silk Road, well, that had repercussions felt all the way across the straits in Yamato. Naka no Oe and Kamatari were both avid students and absorbing all that the continent had to throw at them about philosophy and good governance. As is so often the case, it seems like idealistic students were the fertile ground for revolutionary new thoughts. There were problems implementing their vision, however. Although the Nihon Shoki claims that Naka no Oe was the crown prince, that honor was probably actually given to Prince Furubito no Oe, who would have no doubt perpetuated the existing power structures at court. This is something that the chroniclers, or perhaps those before them, glossed over and may have even tried to retcon to help bolster the case that Naka no Oe was actually working for the common good and not just involved in a naked power grab for himself. There's also the question as to where Yamashiro no Oe had stood in the succession, as he likely also had had a fair number of supporters. Now, with the destruction of Yamashiro no Oe's family, the balance of power shifted. Although Sogono Emishi had long been an influential member of the court, and not solely because of his role as prime minister, well, Sogono Iruka was relatively new to power. Yamashiro no Oe's family, in turn, likely had a fair number of supporters, and even neutral parties may have been turned off by Iruka's violent methods to suppress an opponent who had already been defeated politically. Naka no Oe and Kamatari seem to have seized on this discontent against the Soga, but they needed at least one other conspirator. They achieved this by offering a marriage alliance with Soga no Kurayamada no Ishikawa no Maro, a lesser member of the Soga household whose own immediate family had been supporters of Yamashiro no Oe and so likely had plenty of grievances with his cousins. Naka no Oe married Ishikawa no Maro's daughter, Ochi no Iratsume, also known as Chinu no Iratsume, and together these three, Naka no Oe, Kamatari, and Ishikawa no Maro, brought others into their plot, and finally in 645, they struck. Soga no Iruka was killed at court in front of a shocked Takara Hime and Prince Furubito no Oe. By the way, this is another thing that suggests to me at least that Furubito no Oe was crowned prince, because why was he front and center at the ceremony while Naka no Oe was able to skulk around at the edges tending to things like guards? Anyway, after the assassination at the court, the Ishii incident, Naka no Oe gathered forces and went after Soga no Emishi, since they knew they couldn't leave him alive. With both Soga no Emishi and Soga no Iruka dead, and Takara Hime having abdicated the throne in shock at what had just occurred, Naka no Oe could have taken the throne for himself. However, in what was probably a rather astute move on his part, he chose not to. He recognized that Furubito no Oe's claim to the throne was possibly stronger, and those who had supported the Soga would no doubt push for him to take the throne. And so instead, he pushed for his uncle, Prince Karu, to ascend as sovereign. Karu was Takara Hime's brother, and they could use Confucian logic regarding deference to one's elders to support him. Plus, Karu's hands weren't directly bloodied by the recent conflict. As for Prince Furubito, he saw the way that the winds were blowing. To avoid being another casualty, he retired from the world, taking the vows of a Buddhist monk. However, there were still supporters who were trying to put him on the throne, and eventually he would be killed to avoid being used as a rallying point. Prince Karu, known as Jomei Tenno, ruled for around a decade. During that time, Naka no Oe and his reformers helped to cultivate a new image of the state as a bureaucratic monarchy. Naka no Oe was designated the crown prince, and Nakatomi no Kamatari was made the inner prime minister or Naidaijin. Ishikawa no Maro was made the minister of the right, while Abe no Uchimaro was made the minister of the left, and they ran much of the bureaucracy. But the Naidaijin was a role more directly attached to the royal household, and likely meant that Kamatari was really outside of anyone else's jurisdiction, falling into a position directly supporting Naka no Oe. They instituted Tang-style rank systems and set up divisions of the entire archipelago. They appointed governors of the various countries, now seen as provinces, and made them report up to various ministers and eventually to the sovereign. After all, if you were going to manage everything, you needed to first and foremost collect the data. This period is known as the Taika or Great Change period, and the reforms are known as the Taika Reforms, discussed in episode 108. They even built a large government complex in the form of Toyosaki Palace in Naniwa, though this may have been a bit much. For more of that, check out episodes 112 and 113. Now, years into the project, things seem to have soured a bit. Rumors and slander turned Kamatari against his ally, Ishikawa no Maro, resulting in the death of Ishikawa no Maro and much of his family. Naka no Oe and other members of the royal family eventually abandoned the Naniwa Palace complex, leaving now sovereign Karu and the government officials there to run day-to-day administration while much of the court made its way back to the Asuka area. Karu would later pass away, but the throne still did not pass to Crown Prince Naka no Oe despite his title. Instead, the throne went back to Takara Hime. This was her second reign, and one of only two split reigns like this that we know of. The chroniclers who were creating posthumous titles for the sovereigns gave her two names, Kogyoku Tenno for her reign up to 645, and then Saimei Tenno for her second reign starting in 655. During her latter reign, Naka no Oe continued to wield power as the crown prince, and the chroniclers don't really get into why she came back into power. It may be that Naka no Oe, in his role as crown prince, really had more freedom there. Although the sovereign is purportedly the person in power, that position can also be limiting. There are specific things which the sovereign is supposed to do, rituals in which they are expected to partake. In addition, there were restrictions on who was allowed into the inner sanctum of the palace, and thus limits on who could interact with the sovereign and how. That meant that really any sovereign was reliant on intermediaries to know what was going on in their state and to carry out their orders. As crown prince, Naka no Oe may have had more flexibility to do the things he wanted to do, and he could always leverage the sovereign's authority. When Baekje was destroyed and Yamato decided to go to their aid, Naka no Oe appears to have had a strong hand in raising forces and directing movements, at least within the archipelago. When Takara Hime passed away rather suddenly, he accompanied her funerary procession much of the way back and then returned to Tsukushi, which is to say Kyushu, to direct the war. This is the same thing that Toyotomi Hideyoshi would do when he sent troops to Korea in the late 16th century. Moving headquarters closer to the continent would reduce the time between messages. Theoretically, he could have moved out to the islands of Iki or Tsushima, but I suspect that there were more amenities at Tsukushi, where they even built a palace for Takara Hime and later Naka no Oe in which to reside. It was likely not quite as spectacular as the full-blown city that Hideyoshi developed in a matter of months, but the court could also leverage the facilities previously created for the Dazaifu. Now, this war took time. This wasn't like some wars that were more like just particular military actions. This was a war that dragged on for several years, with different waves of ships going over to transport people and supplies. Things came to a head in the 9th month of 663, roughly October or November on the Western calendar. The Baekje resistance was under siege, and their only hope was a fleet of Yamato soldiers coming to their aid. The Yamato fleet met with a much smaller Tang fleet at the mouth of the Baekje River, that is to say, the Hakusuki Noe. They attempted to break through the Tang blockade, but the Tang had positional advantage and were eventually able to counterattack, destroying the massive Yamato fleet. Without their relief, the Baekje resistance fell apart. The remnants of the Yamato army, along with those Baekje nobles that were with them, headed out, fleeing to the archipelago. One presumes that there may have been other Baekje nobles and their families who had probably already made the trip earlier in the war. Now, after the entry describing this route on the 24th day of the 9th month of 663, we have a bit of a gap in the Chronicles of just a little more than 4 months. We then pick up with Naka no Oe's government starting to look at internal affairs. For one thing, we are told that he selected his younger brother, the royal prince Oama, as crown prince, and he made updates to the cap rank system, changing it from 19 ranks to 26 ranks. The first 6 ranks remained the same, but the name Kwa or flower for the 7th through 10th ranks was changed to Kin, meaning brocade. Furthermore, a middle rank was added between the upper and lower ranks, further distinguishing each group and adding 6 other ranks. Finally, the initial rank Rishin was divided into 2, Daiken and Shoken. We aren't really told why, but it likely meant that they could have more granular distinctions in rank. At the same time that was going on, the court also awarded long swords to senior members of the great families and short swords to the senior members of the lesser families. Below that, senior members of the Tomono Miyatsuko and others were given shields and bows and arrows. Furthermore, the vassals, or kakibe, and the domestic retainers, or yakabe, were settled. The kanji used in the text appears to refer to something like settling a decision or standardizing something rather than settling as in giving a place to live, though that may have been part of it. It seems to me to mean that the court was really settling on what kind of servants any kind of family could have, determining what kind, how many that various houses could have based on their position in the hierarchy. Now, I can't help but notice that all these gifts were very martial in nature. That does not mean, of course, that they were not necessarily because of the war over Baekje, nor that they were in response to the concern about a possible Tang invasion. We've seen in the past where swords were gifted to people who had served the court. But it is hard not to connect these gifts with recent worries. We also know that this year Naka no Oe turned his focus on building defenses, setting up guards and beacon fires on the islands of Tsushima and Iki. And should any unknown fleet be seen coming to the archipelago, these fires would alert the forces at Kyushu so they could send word and prepare a defense. In addition to all that, the court built an impressive defense for Tsukushi, for the Dazai itself, the seat of the Yamato government in Kyushu. It's called the Mizuki, or Water Castle, though at the time, castle was more about walls and fortifications than the standalone fortress we might think of today. So along those lines, the Mizuki was really just an earthen embankment roughly 1.2 kilometers long, extending from a natural ridgeline to the west across the Mikasa River, and archaeological evidence shows that it had a moat, thus Mizuki, and this line of fortifications would have been a line of defense for the Dazai should anyone try to invade. This construction was so large and impressive that you can still see it even today. It stands out on the terrain, and it's even visible from overhead photographs. In the third month of 664, we're told that Prince Xuanwang of Baekje and his people were given residence at Naniwa. In fact, even though Baekje was no longer an independent kingdom, there appear to have been thousands of Baekje people now living in Yamato, unable to return home. Many of these were formal nobles of the Baekje court, which Yamato treated as a foreign extension of its own Yamato court. Resettling these people would be a major theme for the Chronicles, but we will also see as we read further on how their talents were leveraged for the state. Also in the third month, a star fell in the north. It says in the north of the capital, but I suspect that anywhere north, south, east, or west of the capital would have seen the same thing in the north. There was also an earthquake, which isn't given any particular significance beyond its mention as a natural phenomenon. And let's face it, the Japanese archipelago has a lot of earthquakes. Now, on the 17th day of the 5th month of 664, so roughly 2 months later, we're told that Liu Zhenyuan, the Tang Dynasty's general in Baekje, sent Guo Wutsong to Yamato with a letter and gifts. We aren't told the contents of the letter, but one imagines that this may have been a rather tense exchange. Yamato had, after all, just been involved in open warfare against Tang forces on the peninsula, and they still weren't sure if the Tang Empire would come after them next. Their only real hope on that front was Goguryeo, since Tang and Shilla were still trying to destroy the Goguryeo kingdom, and that may have kept the Tang forces tied up for a while. No doubt, Guo Wutsong would have seen some of the defenses that Yamato was constructing during his visit. Now, Guo Wutsong would hang around for about maybe 5 to 7.5 months. He was given permission to take his leave on the 4th day of the 10th month. Naka no Oe had his friend and inner prime minister, Nakatomi no Kamatari, send the Buddhist priest Chisho with presents for Guo Wutsong, and he and his officers were granted entertainments before they left as well. Finally, Guo Wutsong and his people were told return to the Tang on the 12th day of the 12th month. While the delegations from the Tang were in Yamato, we are told of several tragedies. First was that Sogo no Murajiko no Omi had apparently passed away. Sogo no Murajiko appears to have been another son of Sogo no Kuramaro and thus brother to Sogo no Ishikawa no Maro. Unfortunately, we don't have much more on him in the record. And just a month after that, we are told that the Dowager Queen, Shima, passed away. Aston translates this as Queen Grandmother, suggesting that she was Naka no Oe's grandmother. We are also told that in the 10th month of 664, around the time that Guo Wutsong was given leave to depart, that Yun Gesomun, the prime minister, though perhaps more correctly the despotic ruler of Goguryeo, died. It's said that he asked his children to remain united, but even if we didn't know how it all turned out, I think we could look somewhat skeptically on any idea that they all did exactly as they were told. And sure enough, in 667, we hear that Gesomun's eldest son, Namsang, left the capital of Pyongyang to tour the provinces, and while he was gone, his younger brothers conspired with the nobility so that when he came back, they refused to let him back in. So Namsang ran off to the Tang court and apparently helped them destroy his own country. This is largely corroborated by other stories about Goguryeo, though the dates do seem to be off. Tang records put Gesomun's death around 666, which the Samguk Sagi appears to follow, but on his tomb the date would appear to be 665. Confusion like this was easy enough given the different dates and trying to cross-check across different regnal eras. Sure, there were some commonalities, but it was very easy to miscount something. One last note from the 12th month of 664, it seems that there were omens of apparent prosperity that came to the court from the island of Awaji. First, there was rice that grew up in a farmer's pig trough. The farmer's name is given as Shinuta no Fumibito no Mu, and Mu gathered this rice and stored it up, and thus every day his wealth increased. Then there was the bridal bed of Iwaki no Sukuri no O of Kurimoto district. They claimed that rice grew up at the head of his bride's mattress during her first night's stay with him. And this wasn't just some brand new shoot just barely poking out of the ground, but overnight it formed an ear, and by the morning it bent down and ripened. Then the following night, another ear was formed. When the bride went out into the courtyard, 2 keys fell from heaven, and after she gave them to her husband, O, he went on to become a wealthy man. The exact purpose of these stories is unclear, but it seems to be that the chroniclers are choosing to focus on stories of wealth and growth, which speak to how they wanted this reign as a whole, including this sovereign, to likely be remembered. However, more tragedy struck the following year in 665, when Hashibito, another dowager queen, this time the wife of Karu, aka Ko Tokutenno, she passed away on the 25th day of the 2nd month, and then on the 1st day of the 3rd month, 330 people took Buddhist vows for her sake. We're also told that in the 2nd month, the ranks of Baekje were cross-referenced with the ranks of the Yamato court, and then ranks were given out to some of the Baekje nobles that had come across from the continent. Kwisol Chipsa, who was originally ranked as Dalsol in Baekje, was accorded Lower Shokin. Now, Lower Shokin was rank 12 of the 26 in Yamato, but in comparison, Dalsol seems to have been the 2nd rank of 16 in Baekje. Now, along with handing out rank, over 400 Baekje commoners, both men and women, were given residence in Kanzaki district in Aomi. This appears to be an area along the Echi River running from the Suzuka Mountains west toward Lake Biwa. The court granted them rice lands in the following month. Now, at the same time, several high-ranking Baekje nobles were put in charge of building castles at strategic points around the archipelago. These included one castle in Nagato, as well as the castles of Ono and Oyogi in Tsukushi. 2 years later, in 667, we would also see the building of Takayasu Castle in Yamato and Yashima Castle in Yamada, that is in Sanuki, which is modern Kagawa on Shikoku, facing the Seto Inland Sea Passageway. Kaneda Castle in Tsushima was also a Baekje-built one. Now, we mentioned something about these castles last episode. They were in the Baekje style, and as I said, the term castle here is more about the walls, which were largely made of rammed earth ramparts. This means that you would pile up earth and dirt in a layer, and then the laborers would use tools specifically to tamp it down until it was thick and hard. Then another layer was piled on top, and the process was repeated. These walls were often placed on mountaintops where they would follow the terrain, making them places that were easy to defend. Beyond that, they didn't necessarily have a donjon keep or anything like that. Maybe a tower so that one could see a little further, but being at the top of a mountain usually provided all the visual cues one needed. Because they were made of this rammed earth, that's one of the reasons perhaps that some of these still exist and were even used as late as the early 20th century as part of the modern defenses, where gun emplacements were put in things around things like Kaneda Castle, because, well, the defenses were still there to a degree. Now, we know that there are other castles that were made as well beyond those mentioned in the Nihon Shoki. For example, last episode I mentioned about Kinojo in Okayama in the ancient Kibi area. Kinojo is not mentioned in the Nihon Shoki, but it clearly existed back then and matches the general description of a 7th century mountain castle as built in Baekje. The name itself means demon castle, and there's a story about it that's connected to the local Kibitsu Jinja, the shrine to Prince Kibi. According to legend, Kibitsu Hiko, aka Prince Kibitsu, or perhaps more appropriately, the Prince of Kibi, came to the area around the time of Mimaki Iribiko, so probably around the 3rd century, at the head of a large force. Kibitsu Hiko had come to defeat the demon Ura, who lived in the nearby castle, hence Kinojo, Castle of the Demon. The legend says that he freed the people from the demon's rule. As I also mentioned last week, this particular castle may have ended up in the Momotaro story. There are those who believe that the story of Momotaro is based on the story of Prince Kibitsu Hiko and his defeat of the so-called demon Ura. Certainly, the story has grown more fantastical and less connected to the ancient history of the Kibi region, but it still may have its origin in much more standard legend of a founding prince of the ancient Kibi kingdom that was later changed into much more of a fairy tale. Now, more likely, the castle was actually built by a Baekje nobleman or Baekje laborers, often thought to be a prince who settled in the area. There's also the possibility that the demon's name, Ura, came from a mistranslation of this prince's name, or it's also possible that he was totally unrelated to the story at all. The Kibitsu Hiko legend may have already been in existence, and then, as people forgot what Kinojo was all about, they may have then connected it with this story. Now, it would make sense if Kinojo had been built as part of the defenses for Yamato, as that area overlooks a large part of the fertile plains of Okayama and out beyond Kojima to the Seto Inland Sea. It is perched over a key overland route from the western edge of Honshu to Yamato, and there would have been several ways to signal boats to put to sea to intercept any forces on the water. This all suggests to me that Kinojo was probably part of Nakano Oe's castle building effort, even if it isn't specifically remembered in the chronicle. But building castles wasn't enough to bring peace of mind that Yamato would survive a Tang invasion, and it's possibly as a defensive measure that Nakano Oe would go on to do something truly incredible. He would eventually move the capital from Asuka and Naniwa all the way to the shores of Lake Biwa itself, establishing the Otsu Palace and the Otsu capital. This was truly an extreme step that didn't endear Nakano Oe to the court, but it did have several advantages. For one thing, this move pulled the capital further away from the sea routes, meaning that if they were attacked, they had a more defensible position. Even more so than Yamato, the Omi region around Lake Biwa is surrounded by mountains, with a few narrow passes that restricted movement in and out, especially if you didn't know the lay of the land. One of these is the famous Sekigahara, which remained a choke point even up to modern times. The name even means the field of the barrier, indicating the barrier and checkpoint that had been set up there in little less ancient times. Now, moving the capital also pulled the court away from some of the previous political centers, which may have been another feature that made it attractive to Nakano Oe. Many capital moves have been made, at least in part, to get away from, for instance, strong Buddhist temples, and this certainly would have moved things out of the Asuka region, which by now was a hotbed of Buddhist temple activity. But we'll talk more about all that next episode. Until then, I want to thank you for listening, and again, thank you for all your support. If you like what we're doing, please remember to tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, please feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.